The blizzard struck Sandridge like divine retribution, turning the Wyoming sky black as sin and whipping snow across the frozen wasteland with a fury that seemed personal. Sister Agnes Doyle pressed her weathered hands against the chapel's cracked window, watching the storm devour the dying frontier town below. At 35, she had learned to read nature's warnings. This was the kind of winter that buried secrets and froze hearts solid. The chapel door rattled against rusted hinges, and Agnes turned from the window, her breath forming ghostly clouds in the bitter air. The building groaned like a dying animal, its rotting timbers protesting every gust. She had tended this godforsaken sanctuary for 3 years, preaching to empty pews and ghosts of better days. The people of Sandridge had little use for salvation. Survival consumed their every waking moment. A sound pierced the howling wind, thin, desperate, barely human. Agnes froze, listening. There it was again, cutting through the storm like a blade through flesh. Not wind, not some animal caught in nature's trap. Something that made her blood run cold. She grabbed her woolen shawl and fought the door open against the driving snow. The cold struck like a physical blow, stealing breath and bringing tears that froze before they could fall. But there on the chapel steps, nearly buried beneath fresh powder, lay a bundle wrapped in what looked like blood-stained cloth. Agnes dropped to her knees, heart hammering against her ribs. The bundle moved with desperate life. She pulled back the fabric's edge with trembling fingers. A tiny face, blue with cold eyes, squeezed shut against the killing wind. A girl newborn fighting for every breath. Sweet Mary and Joseph. Agnes whispered, gathering the child against her chest. The blanket was soaked with blood. Birth blood, though darker stains suggested violence. Tucked beneath the baby was a scrap of paper ink smeared by snow, but readable. Keep her safe. They killed me for her. Trust no one. E.L. Agnes's hands shook, recognizing the careful script. Ellen Lane handwriting from letters that had once meant everything, letters that stopped coming when Agnes found courage to burn her Boston bridges. Ellen Lane, who had been more than friend, who had been the forbidden love that drove Agnes west seeking redemption. Boot prints led from the steps already filling with snow. Someone had brought this child through the storm, knowing Agnes would find her. Someone who knew about Boston, about Ellen, about secrets Agnes had buried beneath habit and prayer. She looked down at the baby, now quiet in relative warmth. The child's skin was pinking tiny fists, working at air. Hope. She would call her Hope, because in this frozen wasteland, hope remained the one thing nobody could afford to lose. Wind screamed around the chapel like hungry wolves. Agnes hurried inside, barring the door. Whatever had brought this child into her life, whatever blood had been shed, she would not let the storm claim her. Not this child. Not Hope. She built up the fire and wrapped the baby in her own blankets, crooning Irish lullabies from another lifetime. But holding the child close, Agnes couldn't escape the feeling that those boot prints had been watching, waiting. The storm had brought more than wind and cold. It had brought a reckoning that would test every soul in this godforsaken place. Somewhere in the howling darkness beyond her walls were the people who had killed Ellen Lane for this tiny scrap of life, now sleeping in her arms. Morning came gray and bitter, the storm finally spent after its night of fury. Agnes had dozed fitfully by the fire the baby cradled against her chest, starting awake whenever hope stirred. The child had taken water and seemed stronger, but needed proper milk. Warm clothes, medical attention, none of which Agnes could provide alone. She had burned Ellen's note before dawn, watching familiar handwriting curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. Whatever Ellen had done, whatever had gotten her killed, those secrets would die with her. Agnes had learned long ago that some truths were too dangerous for voices, especially in towns where wrong words earned unmarked graves. 3 soft knocks, a pause, 2 more. Elias Quinn's signal. Agnes rose carefully, settling Hope in blankets by the fire before opening the door. The old shopkeeper stood on her steps, gray beard frosted with ice, carrying a canvas bag that clinked with promise. "Thought you might need supplies," Elias said, weathered face creased with concern. "Storm like that drives trouble to doorsteps." Agnes stepped aside to let him enter. Elias Quinn was among Sandridge's few trustworthy souls, a grieving widower who had lost his son to Sheriff Booker's brutality 3 years past. The boy had been caught stealing bread for his sick mother. Booker had beaten him to death in the street while the town watched in silence. Elias had never been the same, but neither had he stopped doing small kindnesses for those who needed them. "What kind of supplies?" Agnes asked, though she suspected he already knew about Hope. Elias set his bag on the rough wooden table, unpacking bottles of goat's milk clean cloth for diapers, a tiny knitted blanket that must have belonged to his grandson. "The kind a woman needs when caring for a baby that ain't supposed to exist." Agnes felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't know what you mean." "Sister, I was checking my traps before dawn. Saw the boot prints, heard the crying." Elias's pale eyes met hers steadily. "Know you well enough to know you'd die before letting innocent children come to harm." Hope stirred in her blankets, making soft sounds. Elias looked toward the fire, expression gentle. "Pretty little thing. Got her mother's chin, though, hard to tell at that age. You think you know who she is? Think there's been talk about the Holloway family and their complications? Ellen Lane hasn't been seen for 2 weeks, though her sister Cora's been asking after her." Elias poured goat's milk into a small bottle, testing temperature on his wrist. "Think that baby's about 2 weeks old, give or take, and somebody wanted her safe enough to risk their life bringing her here." Agnes sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted. "What are people saying?" "Same as always. Trouble follows wherever there's Holloway money. That family's been bleeding this town dry 20 years, buying up land, and businesses putting folks in debt they can't repay." Elias sat across from her, hands folded. "They say old Marcus Holloway's been looking for an heir, seeing as his boy died in that cavalry charge down in Arizona Territory. Word is he found one. And she's been inconvenient. Young women who marry into that family have a way of disappearing, especially when they produce children that might complicate inheritance." Elias's voice was carefully neutral, but Agnes heard underlying anger. "Of course, that's just talk. Could be this little one belongs to anybody." Hope began crying, thin wailing that cut through Agnes like a knife. She reached for the baby, but Elias was already there with warm milk. The child latched onto it desperately, tiny hands gripping glass with surprising strength. "She's hungry," Agnes murmured, watching Hope's face relax as milk filled her belly. "Course she is. Babies need feeding every few hours, need warmth, need someone willing to stand between them and wolves." Agnes met his eyes. "What are you telling me, Elias?" "Telling you Sheriff Booker was asking questions yesterday about anyone heading toward the chapel. Mrs. Watts was spreading word that maybe someone had taken something that didn't belong to them." Elias stood gathering empty bottles. "Whatever brought this child to your door, it ain't over yet." A chill ran down Agnes's spine that had nothing to do with cold. "Will you help me?" Elias Quinn had buried his son, buried his wife, buried most hopes for justice in this world. But looking at the baby in Agnes's arms, something in his weathered face hardened into resolve. "Sister, I've been waiting 3 years for something worth fighting for. Reckon I just found it." He left more supplies than Agnes could have hoped for: food, firewood, warm blankets, and a promise to return. But watching him trudge back through snow toward town, Agnes couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. The chapel suddenly felt very small and isolated, and the baby in her arms seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Hope finished her bottle and fell asleep against Agnes's shoulder, tiny breath warm against the nun's neck. Agnes held her close and stared into the fire, wondering what Ellen Lane had died trying to protect, and whether Agnes would have strength to keep that promise. when wolves finally came calling. Outside, wind began picking up again, rattling chapel walls like bones. The wolves came on the third day, wearing badges and carrying guns. Agnes was changing Hope's diaper when she heard horses approaching, 6 riders moving fast through snow hoofbeats, muffled but unmistakable. She wrapped the baby quickly and moved to the window, heart sinking as she recognized Sheriff Miles Booker's broad shoulders and silver mustache leading the group. Behind him rode 4 deputies she knew by reputation, hard men who did Booker's dirty work without question. The 6th rider was Mrs. Mercy Watts, the town's midwife, her black wool coat making her look like a carry-on crow. Agnes had expected this moment, but still felt her hands tremble, holding Hope closer. The baby stirred, but didn't wake tiny face peaceful in sleep. Whatever happened next, Agnes would not let them take her. Booker's fist hammered the chapel door with enough force to shake the entire building. "Sister Agnes, open up in the name of the law." Agnes took a deep breath, settled Hope in her cradle near the fire, and walked to the door. She opened it just wide enough to show her face, keeping her body between the men and the chapel's interior. "Sheriff Booker," she said evenly. "What brings you out in this weather?" Booker was a big man gone soft around the middle, but his pale eyes still held the predator's gleam that had kept Sandridge under his thumb for a decade. His mustache was frosted with ice cheeks, red with cold and something that might have been desperation. "You know damn well what brings me out here, sister. We're looking for stolen property." "I'm afraid I don't understand." Booker pushed past her into the chapel deputies following. Mrs. Watts came last, sharp eyes, taking in every detail. Agnes fought the urge to look toward the fire where Hope lay sleeping. "Don't play games with me, woman," Booker snarled. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you, and I'm here to collect it." "Sheriff, this is a house of God. I'll thank you to keep a civil tongue." Booker laughed, harsh sound echoing off bare walls. "House of God? This place is barely fit for rats. And from what I hear, you ain't exactly the most godly woman to wear a habit." Heat flashed through Agnes's chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't know what you've heard, but I've heard plenty." Booker interrupted. "No, you came out here from Boston 3 years ago with your tail between your legs. No, there was scandal involved, the kind that gets a woman thrown out of her order." His smile was ugly. "Question is, what exactly did you do to get yourself exiled to this corner of hell?" Agnes felt blood drain from her face. She had thought her past buried deep enough that it couldn't follow, but should have known better. In towns like Sandridge, secrets were currency, and Booker had always been good at collecting debts. "My past is my own business, Sheriff. Not when it affects my investigation." Booker gestured to a deputy who began searching the chapel's sparse furnishings. "See, I think you've got a soft spot for lost causes. When someone left a certain bundle on your doorstep 3 nights ago, you couldn't help yourself. Hope chose that moment to wake her thin cry, cutting through tension like a blade. Every eye turned toward the fire, where the baby's blanket-wrapped form was clearly visible in the wooden cradle Elias had brought. Booker's smile widened. Well, what have we here?" Agnes stepped between the sheriff and the baby, hands clenched at her sides. "A child who needs care and protection. A child who belongs to the Holloway family." Mrs. Watts spoke for the first time, voice sharp as winter wind. "A child whose mother died in childbirth and whose father has every legal right to claim her." "Her mother didn't die in childbirth," Agnes said before she could stop herself. "She was murdered." The words hung in air like smoke. Booker's expression darkened, hand moving to rest on his gun butt. "That's a serious accusation, sister. You got proof?" Agnes's mouth went dry. Ellen's note was ash in her fireplace, and she had no evidence beyond suspicions. You just meant to interfere in matters that don't concern you." Booker moved toward the cradle, and Agnes stepped sideways to block him again. "That baby's going back to her rightful family, and you're going to hand her over nice and peaceful like." "No, The word came out harder than Agnes intended, but she didn't take it back. Hope was crying in earnest now, small voice filling the chapel with desperate sound. Agnes could feel deputies' tensing hands moving toward weapons. No. Booker's voice was dangerously quiet. She's under church protection, Agnes said, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. I won't hand over an innocent child to people who might harm her. Booker backhanded her across the face, the blow sending her stumbling backward. Agnes tasted blood, but didn't fall. She steadied herself and moved back between the sheriff and Hope, cheek throbbing but resolve unchanged. You want to do this the hard way, that's fine by me, Booker growled. Boys, take the baby. Two deputies stepped forward, but Agnes held her ground. If you take her, you'll have to go through me. That can be arranged. The new voice came from the doorway, where Elias Quinn stood silhouetted against gray sky. He wasn't alone. Behind him were three other men Agnes recognized from town: Dr. Samuel Harrison barber Tom Mitchell and Jake Morrison, who ran the livery stable. All were armed. Booker's hand tightened on his gun. This ain't your business, Quinn. Seems to me it's everyone's business when law starts threatening nuns and babies. Elias replied calmly. Especially when that law's been bought and paid for by folks with more money than conscience. You're walking a dangerous line, old man. Elias stepped into the chapel, friends flanking him. I've buried my son, Sheriff. Buried my wife. Buried every hope I had for justice in this town. But I ain't burying any more innocents while I still draw breath. Tension stretched taut as a bowstring. 6 armed men facing 4, with Agnes and Hope caught in the middle. Agnes could see calculation in Booker's eyes. He was outnumbered barely, and a gunfight in the chapel would leave bodies on both sides. And this ain't over, Booker said finally. He gestured to his deputies, who reluctantly stepped back from the cradle. But I'm giving you fair warning, sister. That baby belongs to the Holloway family, and they're going to get her one way or another. You can hand her over peaceful or watch this whole place burn down around your ears. Your choice. Mrs. Watts moved close to Agnes, voice a whisper only the nun could hear. You don't know what you're dealing with, girl. The Holloways don't forget, and they don't forgive. That baby's got a target on her head, and so do you now. The sheriff and his men filed out, leaving Agnes shaking in sudden quiet. Hope had stopped crying, but her eyes were wide and bright, as if she somehow understood the danger surrounding her. Elias put a gentle hand on Agnes's shoulder. You all right, sister? Agnes nodded, though her cheek still throbbed where Booker had hit her. Thank you. All of you. Don't thank us yet, Dr. Harrison said grimly. Booker's not going to let this go. The Holloway family's got too much riding on getting that baby back. What do you mean? Tom Mitchell, a small man with graying hair, spoke up. Marcus Holloway's been looking for an heir ever since his boy died. Word is he's been pressuring young women in the territory to marry into the family, promising money and protection. But those that do, he shrugged. Let's just say motherhood don't seem to agree with them. Agnes felt sick. You think he's been killing them? Think powerful men do whatever they have to do to stay powerful, Elias said quietly. And I think that little girl represents something that could change the balance of power in this whole territory. Jake Morrison cleared his throat. Question is, what do we do about it? Agnes looked down at Hope, who was beginning to drift back to sleep in her cradle. The baby's tiny hand had worked free of her blankets, and Agnes touched it gently with her finger. Hope's grip was surprisingly strong. We protect her, Agnes said, whatever it takes. Elias nodded. Then we'd better get ready for war. War began with whispers that spread like plague through Sandridge's frozen streets. Within 2 days of Booker's visit, the entire town buzzed with rumors about the nun who had stolen the Holloway baby. Mrs. Watts had done her work well, spreading word that Sister Agnes was an unfit guardian. a woman with a scandalous past who had kidnapped an innocent child for twisted purposes. The story grew until some said Agnes planned to sell the baby to slavers. Others claimed she was part of a Catholic conspiracy to steal Protestant children. A few whispered she was in league with the devil himself. Agnes tried ignoring the talk, but it was hard when former friends crossed streets to avoid her, and mothers pulled children away when she appeared. She had ventured into town only once since Booker's ultimatum, desperate for supplies, and the hostility had been palpable. Shop doors slammed when she approached, and more than one person spat in the dirt at her feet. Only Elias Quinn and his small circle stood by her, bringing food and firewood to the chapel, and taking turns standing watch through long winter nights. Dr. Harrison had examined Hope and pronounced her healthy, but warned she would need proper nutrition and warmth to survive harsh weather. Tom Mitchell brought news from his barbershop. The Holloway family was offering a $1,000 reward for return of their stolen granddaughter. And half the men in town were talking about claiming it. But it was Jake Morrison who brought the most disturbing news on the 4th day after Booker's visit. "They're planning something," he said quietly, stamping snow off his boots as he entered the chapel. Agnes was feeding Hope by the fire, and the baby was taking goat's milk eagerly now, small face growing rounder and healthier each day. "What kind of something?" Agnes asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Booker's been meeting with Marcus Holloway every night this week. Word is Holloway's called in some of his boys from the territorial capital, hard men who ain't afraid to get their hands dirty." Jake's weathered face was grim. "There's also talk that if you don't hand over the baby voluntary-like, there might be an accident. Fire spreads fast in these old wooden buildings." Agnes felt cold fear settle in her stomach. He wouldn't dare burn down a church. "Sister, with respect, you ain't been in Sandridge long enough to know what Booker would or wouldn't dare. That man's desperate, and desperate men do desperate things." Elias appeared in the doorway, arms full of split firewood. "Especially when they're in debt up to their eyeballs to the very family they're supposed to be helping." Agnes looked up sharply. "Booker owes money to the Holloways. More than money." Elias replied, dumping wood by the fireplace. "He owes them his life. About 5 years back, Booker got himself into trouble down in Cheyenne, killed a man in what wasn't exactly a fair fight. The territorial marshal was ready to string him up, but Marcus Holloway stepped in, paid for the best lawyer money could buy, made sure charges got dropped." Why would Holloway do that? Because he needed a sheriff who'd do what he was told without asking inconvenient questions. Booker's been Holloway's bought dog ever since, and now that leash is getting tight. Elias warmed his hands by the fire. "Holloway wants that baby, and Booker's the one who's going to deliver her or find himself dangling from a rope." Hope finished her bottle and burped softly against Agnes's shoulder. The baby's eyes were getting brighter each day, and Agnes could swear she was starting to focus on faces. It broke her heart thinking of this innocent child being used as a pawn in the Holloway's power games. "There's something else," Jake said reluctantly. "Mrs. Watts has been asking around about getting hold of some special medicine. The kind that puts babies to sleep permanent-like." Agnes's blood turned to ice. "She's planning to poison Hope. I can't prove it, but that's what it sounds like. She's been telling folks that maybe it would be a mercy seeing as the child's cursed and all." Jake's jaw tightened. Of course, mercy's got nothing to do with it. Dead babies don't inherit fortunes. Agnes stood pacing to the window with Hope in her arms. Snow was falling again, turning the world outside into a white blur. Somewhere out there, powerful men were plotting to take this child's life, and the law was on their side. She felt trapped, helpless like a rabbit in a snare, waiting for the hunter. "There's got to be something we can do," she said desperately. "Some way to get word to the territorial authorities or—" "Sister," Elias interrupted gently. "The territorial authorities are in Marcus Holloway's pocket. The man's got judges, marshals, even some folks in Washington eating out of his hand. That baby girl you're holding is worth millions in land and mining rights, and there ain't nobody in 100 miles who's going to risk crossing the Holloway family for an Irish nun and a foundling child. Agnes turned from the window, eyes blazing. Then we'll do it ourselves. Do what ourselves? Find proof. Find evidence that the Holloways murdered Hope's mother, that they're planning to kill her too. Find something that even bought judges can't ignore. Jake and Elias exchanged glances. Sister, Jake said carefully, that's a dangerous game you're talking about. The kind that gets folks buried in unmarked graves. Everything's dangerous now, Agnes replied. At least if we're fighting back, we're dying on our feet instead of our knees. Hope made a soft cooing sound, tiny hand grabbing at Agnes's finger. The baby's grip was strong, determined as if she was holding on to life itself with everything she had. Agnes looked down at her and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. I made a promise, she said quietly. To Hope's mother, to God, to myself. I'm not breaking it now. Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with memory. My boy Daniel used to say that sometimes a man's got to choose between what's safe and what's right. He chose right, and Booker beat him to death for it. The old man looked at Agnes, eyes bright with unshed tears. But you know what, I was proud of him. Still am. Some things are worth dying for. And some things are worth living for, Agnes added, holding Hope closer. Jake Morrison sighed deeply. All right then. If we're doing this fool thing, we'd better do it smart. What do you need? Agnes felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. Information. I need to know everything about Ellen Lane, where she lived, who she was seeing, what happened in the days before she died. And I need to know more about the Holloway family's business dealings. If they've been killing women for their inheritance rights, there might be other victims, other evidence. I can ask around discreet-like, Jake offered. Folks talk to their barber, tell him things they wouldn't tell their own wives. And I've got contacts in the territorial capital, Dr. Harrison added from the doorway, where he had been listening quietly. Medical men hear things, see things. If the Holloways have been disposing of inconvenient wives, there might be records. Elias nodded slowly. It's a long shot, but it's better than sitting here waiting for them to burn us out. He stood, old bones creaking. But sister, you need to understand, once we start down this path, there's no turning back. We're going to be making enemies of some very powerful people. Agnes looked down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, tiny face serene and trusting. Somewhere out there were people who had killed her mother, who wanted to kill her too for the crime of being born. They had money, power, the law on their side. But they didn't have what Agnes had, the absolute certainty that some things were worth any sacrifice. Well, then we'd better make sure we win, she said. Outside wind picked up again, howling around the chapel like hungry wolves. But inside, by the warm fire, a baby slept safely in the arms of a woman who would die before letting anyone harm her. And in the gathering dusk, 4 men made plans to take on an empire built on blood and fear. The war for Hope's life had begun in earnest. The first blow came not with guns or fire, but with poison hidden behind a grandmother's smile. Mrs. Mercy Watts appeared at the chapel door on a gray morning, carrying a wicker basket covered with checkered cloth and wearing the kind of expression that never quite reached her eyes. Agnes had been expecting some form of attack, but not this, not the pretense of Christian charity from a woman who had helped spread lies about her throughout town. Sister Agnes, Mrs. Watts said warmly, as if their confrontation with Booker had never happened. I've come to apologize for my behavior the other day. Sometimes fear makes us do regrettable things. Agnes stood in the doorway, blocking the older woman's view of the interior, where Hope lay sleeping by the fire. Something in Mrs. Watts's manner, too eager, too friendly, set off warning bells in her mind. "Mrs. Watts, what can I do for you? I brought fresh goat's milk for the little one and some soup for you. Thought you might be running low on supplies." Mrs. Watts lifted the cloth, revealing glass bottles of milk still warm from the animal, and a covered pot that smelled of vegetables and herbs. "It's my way of saying sorry." Every instinct Agnes possessed screamed danger, but she couldn't refuse food for Hope without seeming paranoid. The baby had been drinking goat's milk for days, with no ill effects. Mrs. Watts was known throughout Sandridge as a skilled midwife and healer. If Agnes turned away her help, it would only fuel more rumors about her unfitness to care for a child. "That's very kind," Agnes said carefully, "but I don't want to put you to trouble." "No trouble at all. May I come in? It's bitter cold out here, and I'd like to see how the little angel is doing." Agnes hesitated, then stepped aside. Mrs. Watts entered the chapel with familiarity that seemed practiced, though Agnes was certain this was her first visit. The older woman's sharp eyes catalogued every detail: the makeshift cradle by the fire, the supplies Elias had brought, the defensive preparations that weren't quite hidden well enough. You've made this place quite cozy," Mrs. Watts observed. "And where's our little treasure?" Hope was awake, but quiet, bright eyes, tracking the movement of flames in the fireplace. Mrs. Watts approached the cradle with professional confidence, setting down her basket and reaching for the baby. "May I? I've delivered more children than I can count, including this little one's mother when she was born 23 years ago." Agnes felt her heart skip. "You delivered Ellen Lane?" "Course I did. Brought both those Lane girls into the world, watched them grow up wild and headstrong." Mrs. Watts lifted Hope, gently examining her with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades caring for infants. "This one's got her mother's chin, sure enough. Ellen was always the pretty one, caught every young man's eye in 3 counties. What happened to her?" Mrs. Watts's expression grew sad, but something flickered behind her eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or rehearsed emotion. "Same thing that happens to too many pretty girls around here. She caught the attention of the wrong man. Marcus Holloway's got a weakness for beauty, especially when it comes wrapped in innocence." She settled Hope in the crook of her arm with practiced ease. "Ellen thought she could play that game and win. Thought her looks and charm would be enough to tame a man like Holloway." Agnes sat across from the midwife, trying to appear casual, while every nerve stayed alert. "She married into the family. Secret wedding, from what I heard. Holloway likes to keep his business private, especially when it comes to matters of the heart." Mrs. Watts bounced Hope, gently making soft cooing sounds. "But secrets have a way of coming out, especially when there's a baby involved." "You think Holloway killed her?" Mrs. Watts looked up sharply. "Sister, that's a dangerous question to be asking. Men like Marcus Holloway don't appreciate having their private affairs discussed by outsiders. But she was murdered, wasn't she? Ellen Lane didn't die in childbirth." For a moment, something flickered in Mrs. Watts's eyes, fear-guilt, or maybe just weariness. But then the professional mask slipped back into place. "Ellen Lane died of complications following delivery, same as too many women in this harsh country. The fact that she died alone and afraid don't make it murder, just tragedy." Agnes leaned forward. "You were there when she died." "I was nearby." Mrs. Watts stood still, holding Hope. This baby was born healthy and strong, but her mother was weak from blood loss and fever. Sometimes nature takes its course no matter what we do. Then why the secrecy? Why leave Hope on my doorstep instead of taking her to her father? Mrs. Watts was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the baby in her arms. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because some fathers ain't fit to raise children. Because some men see babies as either assets or liabilities, never as human beings who need love and protection." Agnes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Mrs. Watts, if you know something, I know that little girls need milk to grow strong." Mrs. Watts interrupted, suddenly brisk and professional again. I know that this baby's been crying too much and not sleeping enough, which means she ain't getting proper nutrition. She handed Hope back to Agnes and moved to her basket, pulling out one of the glass bottles. This milk's fresh and rich, just what she needs. Agnes took the bottle reluctantly. The milk looked normal, smelled normal, but something in Mrs. Watts's manner, too insistent, too urgent, raised alarm bells. I appreciate your concern, but, Sister Agnes, I've been delivering babies and caring for mothers longer than you've been alive. Trust me when I tell you what this child needs. The authority in Mrs. Watts's voice brooked no argument. That baby's health depends on getting proper nutrition, and proper nutrition means fresh milk from a healthy animal. Hope began to fuss, making the small sounds Agnes had learned meant hunger. The baby's routine was becoming predictable. She woke every 3 hours wanting food, and it had been nearly 4 hours since her last feeding. Mrs. Watts was right about that timing. I suppose a little wouldn't hurt, Agnes said, testing the milk's temperature on her wrist. It felt warm, but not hot, exactly as it should be. Course it wouldn't. That milk's as pure and wholesome as anything you'll find in the territory. Mrs. Watts gathered her basket and moved toward the door. I'll leave you to your feeding then. But sister, I hope you'll think about what I said about fathers and children and what's best for everyone involved. After Mrs. Watts left, Agnes sat by the fire, holding the bottle and looking down at Hope, who was making increasingly demanding sounds for her feeding. The milk looked perfect, smelled perfect, felt exactly the right temperature. But Agnes couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the midwife's visit had been about more than charity and apology. She held the bottle up to the light, examining the milk carefully. It looked exactly like the goat's milk Elias had been bringing, creamy white with no unusual color or consistency. But something Mrs. Watts had said bothered her. That baby's been crying too much and not sleeping enough. How could she know that Agnes had been careful to keep Hope's routine private, and the chapel's thick walls should have muffled any sound? Hope's crying grew more insistent, tiny fists working at the air. Agnes made a decision that might save the child's life, or might doom them both. Instead of feeding Hope the milk immediately, she set the bottle aside and went to her small store of emergency supplies. Hidden behind a loose board in the wall was a tiny vial of ipecac syrup that Dr. Harrison had given her years ago, along with a dropper and instructions for inducing vomiting in case of poisoning. She put a few drops of the milk on her tongue, first testing for any unusual taste. It seemed normal, but some poisons were tasteless. Then she took the dropper and put a small amount of the milk into a tin cup, adding a single drop of ipecac. If the milk was pure, nothing would happen. If it contained something toxic, the reaction might tell her what she needed to know. The mixture began to foam almost immediately, turning an ugly greenish color that made Agnes's stomach lurch. Laudanum, she recognized the reaction from her time working with Dr. Harrison. Someone had laced the milk with enough opium tincture to put Hope into a deep, permanent sleep. Agnes felt rage and terror war in her chest as she looked down at the baby, who was crying in earnest now. Mrs. Watts had come here with murder in her basket, wrapped in false kindness and professional concern. If Agnes had fed that milk to Hope, the child would be dead within the hour. And it would look like natural causes, a weak baby who simply hadn't been strong enough to survive. She prepared a clean bottle with safe milk from Elias's supply and fed Hope quickly, her hands shaking with fury. The baby took the milk eagerly, her cries subsiding as her hunger was satisfied. But Agnes's mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. Mrs. Watts would expect results from her poisoned gift. When Hope didn't die as planned, the midwife would know her attempt had been discovered. A soft knock at the door made Agnes jump. 3 taps paused, 2 more Elias's signal. She barred the door behind him as he entered, carrying his usual supplies and wearing a grim expression. "We've got trouble," he said without preamble. Jake Morrison heard from his contacts in town that Booker's planning to move tonight. Word is there's going to be a fire at the chapel, and anyone inside is going to burn with it. Agnes felt her knees go weak. Mrs. Watts was just here. She brought poisoned milk laudanum mixed in with the goat's milk. If I'd fed it to Hope, Elias's weathered face went pale. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. They're not even pretending to be subtle anymore. He looked at the baby in Agnes's arms, then at the bottle of tainted milk sitting on the table. This proves it, though. Proves they're willing to murder an innocent child. It proves they tried, but it doesn't prove who ordered it. Mrs. Watts could claim she made a mistake, mixed up her medicines. Agnes felt the helplessness of their situation pressing down on her like a weight. We need more than suspicion and a bottle of bad milk. Maybe we've got more than that. Elias pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. Dr. Harrison's been asking around about Ellen Lane's death using his medical contacts. Turns out she wasn't the first young woman to die mysteriously after marrying into the Holloway family. Agnes read the paper quickly. It was a list of names and dates written in Dr. Harrison's careful script. 5 women over the past 8 years, all of them young. All of them married to Marcus Holloway or his male relatives. All of them dead within a year of their weddings. The causes of death varied: fever, accident, complications, and childbirth. But the pattern was unmistakable. My God, Agnes whispered. He's been killing them all. Looks that way. And here's the thing: every one of these women brought property or money into the marriage. Land, inheritance, business interests. When they died, everything went to the Holloway family. Elias pointed to the most recent entry. Ellen Lane inherited her father's ranch when he died 2 years ago. 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, plus mineral rights that could be worth a fortune if there's silver in those hills. Agnes felt pieces of the puzzle clicking together in her mind. So, Holloway married her for the land, got her pregnant to secure his claim, then killed her to take everything. But the baby? The baby's the heir, as Ellen's daughter Hope would inherit everything when she comes of age. But if she dies young, everything goes to her closest male relative. Elias's voice was grim. Which would be Marcus Holloway, as her step-grandfather and the executor of Ellen's estate. That's why they can't just take her back. They need her dead. And they need it to look natural, so there's no questions about the inheritance. Elias glanced toward the door. Which is why tonight's fire is perfect. Chapel burns down with the nun and the baby inside. Everyone assumes it was an accident, or maybe God's judgment on a sinful woman. No investigation, no awkward questions. Hope finished her bottle and fell asleep against Agnes's shoulder, her tiny face peaceful and trusting. Agnes looked down at her and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. This child had been born into a world that wanted her dead, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to wealth and power. But she had also been placed in Agnes's care, and that meant something. We're not going to let them burn us, Agnes said quietly. Sister, I admire your faith, but we're up against impossible odds. Booker's got 6 armed men, plus however many guns the Holloways can buy. We've got 4 allies and a prayer. Agnes stood up, settling Hope in her cradle and moving to the window. The snow was falling harder now, and the gray sky was already darkening toward evening. Somewhere out there, men were making final preparations to murder her and an innocent child. They had money, power, the law on their side. But they didn't have what Agnes had learned in her years of exile and redemption. Elias, she said, do you remember what you told me about your son Daniel? About choosing between what's safe and what's right. The old man nodded. Every day of my life. Then help me choose right. Help me save Hope not just from tonight, but from all the nights to come. Agnes turned from the window, her eyes blazing with determination. Help me make sure these bastards never hurt another innocent person again." Elias Quinn looked at her for a long moment, then at the sleeping baby, then back at Agnes. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 years of grief and the promise of redemption. "What do you need me to do?" The midpoint twist came with blood on the snow and a truth that shattered everything Agnes thought she knew about love, betrayal, and the price of secrets. They had been preparing for Booker's attack when she stumbled out of the storm, a young woman, barely older than a girl, her clothes torn and stained with blood, her face gray with cold and pain. Agnes heard the desperate pounding on the chapel door just as Elias finished loading his rifle, and something in the sound made her rush to open it, despite the danger. The woman collapsed into Agnes's arms, her breath coming in short gasps that steamed in the frigid air. "Please," she whispered. "Please help me. They killed her. They killed Ellen." Agnes and Elias helped her inside, settling her by the fire, while Dr. Harrison hurried forward with his medical bag. The stranger was young, maybe 23 or 24, with dark hair and green eyes that were bright with fever and terror. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, clearly broken, and there were rope burns on her wrists that spoke of captivity and torture. "Easy now," Dr. Harrison murmured, examining her injuries. "You're safe here. What's your name?" "Cora," the woman gasped. "Cora Lane. Ellen was my sister." Agnes felt the world tilt around her. Ellen's sister alive when everyone in town had assumed she was dead or disappeared. "Cora, where have you been? People said you vanished weeks ago. Holloway's men took me the night Ellen died. They wanted to make sure I couldn't tell anyone what really happened." Cora's voice was barely above a whisper, but her eyes burned with fury. "They kept me locked up in an old mining shack up in the hills, told me they were going to kill me once they found the baby." Elias leaned forward. "What exactly did happen to Ellen?" Cora closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She married Marcus Holloway in secret, just like he wanted. He promised her the world said he'd protect her, give her everything she ever dreamed of. But it was all lies. He just wanted Papa's ranch, wanted the mineral rights. We figured that much," Agnes said gently. "But how did she die? Holloway didn't kill her directly. He had Mrs. Watts do it." Cora's voice turned bitter. "That woman's been his creature for years, helping him dispose of inconvenient wives and making it look natural. Ellen went into labor 2 weeks ago, and Watts was there to help with the delivery." Dr. Harrison looked up from bandaging Cora's arm. "What did she do?" "Gave Ellen something during the birth, said it was for the pain, but it was poison. Ellen knew what was happening, knew she was dying. She begged Watts to save the baby, promised her money, anything. But Watts just laughed." Cora's hands clenched into fists. "Said the baby was going to die too, just as soon as they figured out how to make it look like an accident." Agnes felt sick. The woman who had come to her chapel with poisoned milk, who had held hope in her arms and spoken of tragedy and natural causes, was a murderer who had been killing for years. "How did Hope end up on my doorstep?" Agnes asked. Ellen wasn't completely helpless. She had arranged for someone to help her if things went wrong. Cora looked directly at Agnes, her green eyes steady despite her pain. "Someone she trusted from Boston, someone she wrote to about her fears and her plans." Agnes felt her blood turn to ice. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying my sister was in love with you, Sister Agnes Doyle. Had been for years, ever since you left Boston. She kept every letter you sent, talked about you constantly." Cora's voice grew stronger. When she realized Holloway was planning to kill her, she arranged for her friend to bring the baby to the one person she knew would protect her, the woman she loved. The chapel fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and Hope's soft breathing. Agnes stared at Cora, trying to process what she was hearing. Ellen had been in love with her, had arranged for Hope to be brought to the chapel. But that meant The person who brought hope to me, Agnes said slowly. Who was it? But before Cora could answer, Dr. Harrison spoke up from where he was tending her wounds. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. That would be me, Agnes. I brought the baby to you. Agnes felt the world stop spinning. What? Ellen came to me 3 weeks before she died. She was terrified, said Holloway was planning to kill her after the birth. She had this letter. He reached into his coat and pulled out a blood-stained piece of paper. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would take the baby to you. She said you were the only person in the territory she trusted to protect her daughter. Agnes took the letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, but unmistakably Ellen's careful script. My dearest Agnes, if you are reading this, then I am dead, and my daughter is in your care. I pray to God you will find it in your heart to protect her, even knowing the truth of what I have done. I loved you in Boston, loved you more than was proper or safe. When you left to seek redemption in the West, I thought my heart would break. But I understood why you had to go, why you couldn't stay and risk both our souls. I tried to forget that you tried to build a life here in Wyoming. But when Marcus Holloway offered me marriage and security, I said yes for the wrong reasons. I thought I could use his money and power to create something good. Maybe even to bring you back to me someday. I was a fool. Holloway is a monster who sees women as property and children as obstacles to wealth. He married me for Papa's land, and now he plans to kill me and our baby to claim it all. I have asked Dr. Harrison to bring my daughter to you if my fears prove true. Her name is Hope Doyle Lane. I have given her your name because I want her to be yours in every way that matters. Raise her as your own, teach her to be strong and brave and good. The deed to Papa's ranch is hidden in the chapel behind the loose stone near the altar. It names Hope as my heir, but only if she lives to claim it. Holloway doesn't know about the deed. He thinks everything will come to him automatically when we die. I know I have no right to ask this of you, but please, Agnes, save my daughter. Save our daughter. Show her the love I never had the courage to ask for myself. All my love, always, Ellen. Agnes's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the letter. Ellen had loved her, had been planning to name her. Hope's guardian had hidden legal documents that could change everything. But more than that, Ellen had trusted her with the most precious thing in the world, a child who carried both their names. But there was something else, something that didn't make sense. Dr. Harrison, she said slowly, if you brought Hope to me on Ellen's instructions, why didn't you tell me? Why let me think she had been abandoned by strangers? Dr. Harrison looked down at his hands, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with guilt. Because I was a coward, Agnes. Because I was afraid of what Holloway would do if he found out I had helped Ellen. I thought if you didn't know where the baby came from, you'd be safer. If anyone asked, I could claim ignorance. Agnes felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Dr. Harrison, what aren't you telling me? I'm telling you that I've been playing both sides of this game from the beginning. His voice was barely audible. Holloway's been paying me for years to keep quiet about the women who died. Not just to keep quiet, to help them die when necessary. The chapel erupted into chaos. Elias swung his rifle toward Dr. Harrison, while Jake Morrison cursed and reached for his gun. But Dr. Harrison held up his hands, tears streaming down his face. I never wanted to be part of it, he said desperately. But Holloway had leverage on me. He knew about my gambling debts, about the morphine I'd been taking from my own supplies. He said he'd ruin me, have me arrested if I didn't cooperate. Agnes felt betrayed in ways she hadn't known were possible. How many women, Samuel? How many did you help murder? 3, he whispered, including Ellen. But Agnes, I swear to you I never touched the baby. I brought her to you exactly as Ellen asked. I thought maybe if I could save Hope, it would balance the scales somehow. You bastard. Elias snarled, keeping his rifle trained on the doctor. You helped them kill innocent women, and now you expect forgiveness. I don't expect forgiveness, Dr. Harrison said quietly. I expect to hang for what I've done. But first I need to help you save Hope. Because that little girl is the only good thing to come out of all this blood and death. Agnes looked down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully in her cradle, innocent of the betrayal and murder that surrounded her birth. Everything she thought she knew about the past few days had been a lie. Dr. Harrison, one of her most trusted allies, had been working for the enemy all along. But he had also saved Hope's life by bringing her to the chapel instead of letting Holloway's men kill her. The deed, Agnes said urgently. Is it really there? Cora nodded. Ellen showed it to me before the wedding. Papa had it drawn up legal-like, naming Ellen as sole heir and specifying that if she died, everything would go to her children. Holloway never saw it. He thought Papa's will was the only legal document that mattered. Elias was already moving toward the altar, running his hands along the stone wall. Here, he called. There's a loose stone here, just like she said. He worked the stone free and reached into the cavity behind it, pulling out an oilcloth package. Inside was a folded document official-looking with seals and signatures, along with a small jewelry box and another letter. Dr. Harrison examined the deed carefully, his medical knowledge extending to legal documents. This is legitimate, all right. Drawn up by a territorial lawyer and properly witnessed. It makes Ellen Lane the sole owner of her father's property and names any children she might have as her heirs. He looked up at Agnes. If this is genuine, Hope owns 5,000 acres of prime ranch land, plus mineral rights that could be worth a fortune. It's genuine, Cora said firmly. Papa was careful about such things. He knew men like Holloway would try to steal everything if they could, so he made sure Ellen's rights were protected. Agnes opened the jewelry box with trembling fingers. Inside was a simple gold locket on a chain engraved with the initials EIL and AD intertwined. Ellen's last gift to her, a symbol of the love they had never been able to speak aloud. There's more, Cora continued. The second letter explains everything Holloway's other murders, Mrs. Watts's role in covering them up, even Sheriff Booker's debts, and why he's willing to burn down a church to keep his secrets safe. Agnes read the second letter quickly, her heart pounding. Ellen had documented everything. Names, dates, methods of murder, financial records that showed how the Holloway family had been systematically killing women and stealing their property for years. It was enough evidence to hang half the power structure of Sandridge if they could get it to honest authorities. But even as she read, Agnes was aware of the sound of horses approaching outside. Many horses moving fast through the snow. Booker and his men were coming, and they would be here soon. We have to get these documents to safety, she said. Sister. Elias said grimly, looking out the window. We've got bigger problems than document storage. Booker's brought an army. Agnes moved to the window and felt her heart sink. At least 20 riders were surrounding the chapel carrying torches and rifles. Booker's voice carried clearly through the cold air. Sister Agnes, you've got something that belongs to the Holloway family, and we're here to collect it. Send out the baby and the Lane woman, and maybe we'll let you live. Agnes felt everything crystallize in that moment. Ellen's love, Hope's future, the truth about years of murder and corruption, it all came down to this. She could surrender and hope for mercy, or she could fight and probably die. But if she surrendered, Hope would die anyway, and the Holloways would continue their reign of terror. She looked at Hope, sleeping peacefully in her cradle, then at Cora, who was struggling to sit up despite her injuries, then at Elias, who was checking his weapons with grim determination. Even Dr. Harrison, despite his betrayal, was preparing to fight for the child he had helped save. No. Agnes called back through the door. Hope stays with me, and so does Cora. If you want them, you'll have to come through me." Booker's laughter was ugly in the night air. "Have it your way, sister." Boys lighted up. Agnes saw the torches moving toward the chapel walls, and she knew their war was about to become a battle for survival. But she also knew something Booker didn't, that Ellen had loved her enough to trust her with everything that mattered. And that love was stronger than fear, stronger than greed, stronger than all the evil men could devise. She picked up Hope and held her close, feeling the baby's warm breath against her neck. Whatever happened next, she would not let this child die for the sins of men who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to wealth. The first flames began to lick at the chapel walls, and Agnes prepared to fight for Hope's life and for the love that had brought them together. The chapel became a furnace of desperation as Booker's men set fire to the outer walls. But what followed was not the easy victory the sheriff had expected. Agnes and her allies had spent the afternoon preparing for this moment, and they had learned hard lessons about survival in Wyoming's unforgiving landscape. Elias had positioned buckets of sand and snow around the interior walls, while Jake Morrison had created choke points from pews and altar furniture. Tom Mitchell had brought his hunting rifle and enough ammunition to make the attackers pay dearly for every inch. But most importantly, they had prepared an escape route, a tunnel that Elias had discovered running from the chapel's basement to an abandoned mine shaft 50 yards away. As flames began climbing the eastern wall, Agnes wrapped Hope in warm blankets and handed her to Cora. "Can you carry her with your arm?" Cora nodded, cradling the baby against her chest with her good arm. "I won't let anything happen to her." "The tunnel's our last resort," Agnes said to the group. "But first, we make them pay for every woman they've killed." The chapel's thick stone walls would resist fire longer than Booker expected, and the men outside had made a crucial mistake. They assumed their enemies were helpless victims rather than fighters with nothing left to lose. Agnes had spent 3 years in this harsh land, learning to survive. And survival sometimes meant violence. She positioned herself at the front window with one of Elias's rifles sighting down the barrel at the shadowy figures moving around the building. When she fired, one of Booker's men screamed and fell clutching his shoulder. The others dove for cover behind rocks and scrub-brushed their torches scattered in the snow. "God damn it!" Booker's voice roared through the night. "I thought you said she was just a nun." "She is just a nun," Mrs. Watts replied from somewhere in the darkness. "But she's got help and they're better armed than we thought." Elias appeared at the side window, his old hunting rifle steady in his hands. "You men out there," he called, "you're fighting for the wrong side. The Holloways have been murdering women and children for years, and you're helping them do it." "Shut up, old man," Booker snarled back. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know Marcus Holloway killed Ellen Lane for her inheritance. I know Mrs. Watts poisoned her during childbirth, and I know you're all going to hang for it when the truth comes out." But as the battle raged, a new horror emerged. Dr. Harrison, who had been positioned at the back window, suddenly turned his rifle toward the interior of the chapel. "I'm sorry, Agnes," he said, his voice breaking, "but they've got my daughter. If I don't deliver Hope to them alive, they'll kill her." Agnes felt her world collapse. Even after his confession, she had hoped Dr. Harrison could be trusted to fight for Hope's life. But Holloway had found the perfect leverage, the doctor's own child. "Samuel, no," Agnes pleaded. "We can find another way." "There is no other way," Dr. Harrison said, tears streaming down his face. "They took her yesterday. Said they'd send me proof of life once I handed over the baby." He swung his rifle toward Cora, who was holding Hope by the fire. "Give me the child, Cora. Please, I can't let my little girl die." But Cora Lane had endured captivity torture and the loss of her sister. She was not about to surrender the one thing Ellen had died to protect. "You want her? You'll have to take her from my corpse," she snarled, moving to put the fire between herself and Dr. Harrison. The standoff lasted only seconds before Elias made his choice. His rifle barked once, and Dr. Harrison crumpled to the floor, clutching his chest. "I'm sorry, Samuel," the old man said quietly. "But some betrayals can't be forgiven." Dr. Harrison looked up at them with dying eyes. "My daughter," he whispered. "Please, find my daughter." "We will," Agnes promised, "but not by sacrificing hope." The battle outside was escalating. Booker had ordered his men to rush the chapel from all sides at once, and the small group of defenders was being overwhelmed. Agnes saw dark shapes moving through the smoke guns, blazing torches held high to complete their work of destruction. The front door exploded inward under the impact of multiple bodies, and Sheriff Booker burst into the chapel with 3 of his deputies behind him. Agnes swung her rifle around, but Booker was faster. His Colt .45 barked twice, and Agnes felt fire tear through her left shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing into the wall. "Got you now, sister," Booker snarled, advancing with his gun trained on her chest. "Should have minded your own business." But the sheriff had forgotten about Elias Quinn, who rose from behind the altar with his rifle at his shoulder. "Should have let my boy live," he said quietly, and pulled the trigger. The bullet took Booker center mass, driving him backward into his own men. The sheriff looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt, then back at Elias, with something like surprise in his eyes. "You shot me," he said wonderingly. "Damn right I did. For Daniel and for every other innocent person you've hurt." Elias worked the bolt on his rifle, chambering another round. "And I'll shoot you again if you don't stay down." Booker tried to raise his gun, but his strength was failing. He collapsed to his knees, then pitched forward onto his face, his blood mixing with the melting snow that had blown in through the shattered door. But the fight wasn't over. More men were pouring through the door, and the flames were climbing higher on the walls. Agnes struggled to her feet, her wounded shoulders screaming in protest, and looked around at the chaos surrounding them. The tide of battle turned when Mrs. Watts appeared in the doorway, carrying a sawed-off shotgun and murder in her eyes. She was searching for hope among the chaos and smoke, determined to finish what she had started with the poisoned milk. "Where's the baby?" she screamed. "Where's the little bastard?" Cora stepped out from behind the altar, hope still cradled in her arms, her green eyes blazing with fury. "Right here, you murdering witch." Mrs. Watts swung her shotgun toward them, but Cora was ready. With her good hand, she threw the heavy brass candlestick from the altar, catching the midwife square in the face. Mrs. Watts staggered backward, blood streaming from her broken nose, and Cora followed up by driving her knee into the older woman's stomach. "Now this is for Ellen," Cora snarled, grabbing the shotgun and turning it on its owner. "This is for every woman you've killed." The blast echoed through the chapel like thunder, and Mrs. Watts crumpled to the floor, her reign of terror finally ended. Cora stood over the body, her chest heaving, hope still safe in her arms. But their victory was short-lived. The flames were spreading faster than their defenses could contain, and more of Booker's men were pressing their attack. The chapel was becoming a death trap, and they had only minutes before the roof collapsed. The tunnel," Agnes shouted over the noise of gunfire and crackling flames. "We have to go now." Elias was already moving toward the concealed entrance in the floor behind the altar, while Jake Morrison and Tom Mitchell provided covering fire. But Agnes realized with growing horror that they had forgotten about the documents. Ellen's proof of the Holloway's crimes was still sitting on the altar table directly in the path of the advancing flames. Without thinking, she lunged for the papers, her wounded arm nearly useless, but her determination absolute. The documents were more than evidence. They were Hope's inheritance, her future, the key to justice for Ellen, and all the other women who had died for the Holloway family's greed. She grabbed the oilcloth packet just as a burning beam crashed down from the ceiling, missing her by inches. The heat was becoming unbearable, and smoke was filling the chapel so thickly that she could barely see. But she had the documents, and Hope was safe with Cora. And maybe, just Maybe they could all get out of this alive. Elias was calling her name from the tunnel entrance, his voice hoarse with smoke and desperation. Agnes stumbled toward him, clutching the documents to her chest, her vision blurring from pain and smoke inhalation. Behind her, the chapel that had been her sanctuary for 3 years was dying in flames, but the love and courage it had sheltered would survive. As she reached the tunnel entrance, Agnes heard new sounds from outside, horses approaching at a gallop, men shouting orders, the distinctive crack of military rifles. For a moment, she thought it was more of Holloway's men coming to finish the job. But then she heard a voice that made her heart leap with hope. "This is Colonel William Hayes of the 3rd Cavalry. Throw down your weapons and surrender." Federal troops had arrived, honest soldiers who might actually listen to their evidence and bring justice to Sand Ridge. Agnes allowed herself a moment of relief as she handed the documents to Elias and prepared to follow him into the tunnel. But their war wasn't over yet. Somewhere in the burning chaos above, Marcus Holloway himself was making his final desperate play for power. The tunnel saved their lives, but it was Colonel Hayes and his cavalry troop who saved their cause. Agnes emerged from the abandoned mine shaft to find herself in the middle of a military operation that looked like something from the territorial wars. 50 U.S. cavalry soldiers had surrounded the burning chapel, their rifles trained on the scattered remnants of Booker's gang. The colonel himself was a tall, weathered man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier violence. And he was very interested in the blood-stained documents Agnes clutched in her good hand. Sister Agnes Doyle, I presume. Colonel Hayes dismounted from his horse and approached carefully, his hands visible and non-threatening. "I'm Colonel William Hayes, 3rd Cavalry Regiment. We received an urgent telegram from the territorial governor requesting federal intervention in what was described as a conspiracy involving multiple homicides." Agnes looked around at the chaos, the chapel burning like a torch against the night sky. Wounded men scattered in the snow, the bodies of Booker and Mrs. Watts being covered with blankets by the soldiers. "Who sent the telegram?" "A Dr. Samuel Harrison contacted the governor's office 3 days ago, claiming he had evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving local officials and prominent citizens." Hayes looked at the documents in Agnes's hands. "Before he died in that burning building, he managed to give my aide a message, said you had the evidence that could expose the whole rotten system." Agnes felt a pang of grief for Dr. Harrison, despite his betrayal. In the end, he had tried to do the right thing, even if it cost him his life. "Ellen Lane's confession," she said, holding out the documents. "Everything about the Holloway murders going back 8 years. Names, dates, methods, it's all here." Colonel Hayes took the documents carefully, his expression growing grimmer as he scanned Ellen's carefully written account. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "If this is true, we're looking at one of the largest criminal conspiracies in territorial history." "It's true." Cora Lane spoke up, still holding hope protectively. "Every word of it. I saw them murder my sister, and they would have killed me too if I hadn't escaped." "And where is Marcus Holloway now?" Hayes asked. Elias Quinn stepped forward, his rifle still in his hands. "Last I heard, he was holed up in his mansion on the hill with whatever men he's got left, probably figuring his next move." As if summoned by their words, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the night. But instead of an attack, a single rider appeared under a white flag of truce, a young man Agnes didn't recognize, wearing expensive clothes and a terrified expression. "Colonel Hayes," the young man called out. "I'm Thomas Holloway, Marcus Holloway's nephew. My uncle sent me to discuss terms." Hayes stepped forward. "What terms? Your uncle has wanted for multiple counts of murder." "There are no terms. He says he has information you want. About other territories, other families who've been doing the same kind of business." Thomas's voice was shaking. "He says he'll trade everything he knows for safe passage to Mexico." Agnes felt rage flare in her chest. After everything, the murders, the terror, the attempt to burn them alive. Marcus Holloway thought he could bargain his way out of justice. "No," she said firmly. "No deals, no bargains. He has to pay for what he's done." Colonel Hayes looked at her with respect. "Sister, I understand your feelings, but if Holloway has information about other criminal operations, then you can get it from him after he's in custody." Agnes interrupted. "But he doesn't get to walk away from this. Too many women have died for his greed." The colonel was quiet for a moment, weighing his options. Finally, he turned back to Thomas Holloway. "Tell your uncle he has 1 hour to surrender unconditionally. If he doesn't come out by then, we're coming in after him." Thomas nodded frantically and spurred his horse back toward the mansion. As he disappeared into the darkness, Agnes felt the weight of Hope's future settling on her shoulders. The baby was the key to everything, the heir to Ellen's property, the living proof of the Holloway's crimes, the symbol of hope for a better future. But the hour passed without Marcus Holloway's surrender. Instead, as Colonel Hayes prepared his men for an assault on the mansion, a new figure emerged from the shadows, a woman Agnes had never seen before, but whose face bore a striking resemblance to Dr. Harrison. "Please," the woman cried, running toward the soldiers. "Please help me. I'm Sarah Harrison, Dr. Harrison's daughter. They've been holding me prisoner for days." Agnes felt her heart leap with hope and grief. Dr. Harrison had died believing his daughter was in danger, but she had managed to escape on her own. At least some good had come from this night of blood and fire. Colonel Hayes quickly organized a rescue operation. But when his men stormed the Holloway mansion, they found it empty, except for a handful of servants who surrendered immediately. Marcus Holloway had fled during the night, along with whatever gold and documents he could carry. "He won't get far," Hayes assured Agnes. "I've got men watching every road and telegraph station between here and the Mexican border. He'll be caught within the week." But Agnes wasn't satisfied with promises. She had learned too much about the corruption of power to trust that justice would automatically prevail. "What about the other families?" Ellen mentioned, "the other territories where this kind of thing is happening?" "We'll investigate every lead, I promise you that. This case is going to send shockwaves through the entire territorial government." Hayes looked at the documents again. "Your friend Ellen Lane may have saved dozens of lives by documenting everything so carefully." As dawn broke over Sand Ridge, the full scope of their victory began to become clear. The Holloway Empire was in ruins, its criminal leadership dead, or fled its network of corruption, exposed to federal investigation. Sheriff Booker was dead, his deputies scattered or under arrest. Mrs. Watts would never poison another child. The reign of terror that had gripped the town for years was finally over. But for Agnes, the most important victory was much smaller and more personal. Hope Doyle Lane was safe, healthy, and legally hers to raise. The baby who had been born into a world that wanted her dead would grow up knowing she was loved and protected, that she had value beyond her inheritance. Agnes stood outside the smoldering ruins of her chapel, holding Hope in her arms, while Cora stood beside her. The building that had been her sanctuary was gone, but the love and courage it had sheltered would continue. Somewhere in a new place, with new challenges, they would build a life worthy of Ellen's sacrifice. "What now?" Cora asked softly. Agnes looked down at Hope, who was beginning to wake up, her bright eyes focusing on Agnes's face with growing recognition. The baby's tiny hand reached up and grabbed Agnes's finger with surprising strength, holding on as if she knew exactly who was keeping her safe. "Now we make sure Marcus Holloway faces justice," Agnes said grimly. "And we make sure no other woman suffers what Ellen suffered." Colonel Hayes approached them, his weathered face serious. "Sister, I have a proposition for you. The territorial government is creating a new position, a federal advocate for women and children in cases involving property rights and inheritance disputes. The job would involve traveling throughout the West, investigating suspicious deaths, building cases against men who think they can murder their way to wealth. Agnes felt her pulse quicken. It would be dangerous work, but it would also be meaningful, a chance to use Ellen's sacrifice to protect others who might face similar threats. What about Hope? She would travel with you, of course. And Miss Lane has already agreed to serve as your deputy. Hayes smiled slightly. It seems you've built quite a team here. Agnes looked at Cora, who nodded encouragingly. Ellen would want you to take the job, Cora said. She'd want you to make sure her death meant something. Then I accept, Agnes said. But I have conditions. I want full federal authority to investigate and prosecute these cases. And I want the resources to build a network of honest lawmen and medical professionals who can recognize and document evidence of foul play. No, done. Hayes agreed. Your first case will be tracking down Marcus Holloway and making sure he faces justice for what he's done here. 3 days later, Agnes stood at Ellen's grave with Hope in her arms. The baby was nearly 3 months old now, healthy and alert, her bright eyes taking in everything around her with obvious intelligence. She had Ellen's chin and nose, but her eyes were darker, more serious, as if she already understood the weight of her inheritance. Now, your mother loved you more than life itself, Agnes whispered to the baby. She died to keep you safe, and she trusted me to raise you right. I promise you, Hope Doyle Lane, that I will never let anyone hurt you the way they hurt her. Hope made soft cooing sounds and grabbed at Agnes's finger with her tiny fist. Agnes took it as agreement, a pact between them that would last the rest of their lives. Cora approached from behind, carrying saddlebags packed with their few possessions. The horses are ready, she said. Colonel Hayes says his men picked up Holloway's trail heading south toward Colorado Territory. If we leave now, we can catch up with the pursuit team by tomorrow evening. Agnes nodded, taking one last look at the simple wooden cross that marked Ellen's grave. I'll find him, Ellen, she promised. And I'll make sure he pays for what he did to you. As they rode out of Sandridge, Agnes felt the weight of their mission settling on her shoulders. They were heading into unknown territory, chasing a desperate man who had already proven he would kill to protect his secrets. But they were also carrying something powerful, the truth documented in Ellen's careful handwriting, backed by federal authority, and the determination to see justice done. Hope slept peacefully in the sling across Agnes's chest, lulled by the rhythm of the horse's gait. Cora rode beside them, her broken arm healing, but her resolve as strong as ever. Behind them, Sandridge was already beginning to rebuild. New sheriff, new hope, new chance for decent people to make honest lives. But ahead of them lay the real work, tracking down Marcus Holloway and the network of corruption he represented, building cases that would stand up in federal court, creating a system where women like Ellen could live without fear of being murdered for their property. It took 5 days of hard riding through mountain passes and river valleys before they caught up with Holloway. Colonel Hayes's men had cornered him in a box canyon near the Colorado border, where he had made his final stand with the last of his hired guns. Agnes arrived just as the shooting stopped. Marcus Holloway lay dead in the dust, his dreams of escape and wealth ended by a cavalry trooper's bullet. Around him were scattered the documents he had tried to save: financial records, property deeds, correspondence with other criminal families throughout the West. It's over, Colonel Hayes said as Agnes approached the body. Marcus Holloway will never hurt another woman. Agnes looked down at the man who had caused so much suffering and felt nothing but emptiness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back Ellen or the other women who had died for his greed. What about the others? The network Ellen wrote about? We'll get them, Hayes promised. These documents prove everything: names, locations, methods. It's going to take years to root out all the corruption, but we'll do it. Agnes nodded, holding Hope closer. The baby was awake and alert, her bright eyes seeming to take in everything around her. She would grow up in a world where justice was possible, where powerful men couldn't murder with impunity, where women like her mother would be protected by law rather than abandoned to their fate. 2 years later, Agnes stood on the porch of their new home in Denver, watching Hope play in the garden with the children of their neighbors. The little girl was everything Ellen could have hoped for: strong, intelligent, fearless, and kind. She spoke 3 languages, could read better than most adults, and had already shown an intuitive understanding of justice that reminded Agnes powerfully of her mother. The inheritance battles had finally been resolved in Hope's favor, with the territorial Supreme Court ruling definitively that she was Ellen Lane's legitimate heir. The Holloway family's remaining assets had been liquidated and distributed to the victims of their crimes, while Hope's ranch and mineral rights had been placed in a trust managed by Agnes and Cora until she came of age. Agnes's work as a federal advocate had grown beyond anything she had imagined. She now traveled throughout the West, investigating cases of suspicious deaths and missing women, building networks of honest lawmen and medical professionals who could recognize and document evidence of foul play. The Agnes Network, as the newspapers called it, had been responsible for exposing corruption in 12 territories and bringing over 100 criminals to justice. Cora had married a federal marshal the previous year, a quiet ceremony that brought together all the survivors of the Sand Ridge conspiracy. She was expecting their first child, and Agnes was looking forward to Hope having a cousin to grow up with. The marshal had specialized training in investigating crimes against women and children and had become an integral part of their growing network. Elias Quinn had passed away peacefully 6 months earlier, but not before seeing Hope take her first steps and speak her first words. He had left her his rifle and a letter to be opened on her 18th birthday, along with stories about her mother that would help her understand her heritage. Agnes kept his memory alive by telling Hope about the brave old man who had helped save her life. On this particular morning, as Agnes watched Hope chase butterflies through the garden, a familiar figure appeared at their front gate. Colonel Hayes, now promoted to general and commander of all federal law enforcement in the Western Territories, was leading a small delegation that included several officials Agnes didn't recognize. Sister Agnes, Hayes said formally, though his eyes were warm with friendship. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but we have some news that we thought you should hear in person. Agnes invited them into her parlor, where Hope immediately attached herself to the general's leg with the confidence of a child who had never known a world where lawmen couldn't be trusted. Hayes lifted her onto his knee with practiced ease. He had become something of an honorary uncle over the years. What kind of news? Agnes asked, though she could see from the men's expressions that it was significant. We've been following up on leads from the Holloway case investigating similar operations in other territories, Hayes began. What we found was bigger than we ever imagined. The Holloway conspiracy wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a network that stretched from California to Kansas, involving hundreds of families and millions of dollars in stolen property. One of the other men, who introduced himself as a prosecutor from the Department of Justice in Washington, leaned forward. Miss Doyle, your work has been instrumental in exposing this network. The evidence you've gathered, the cases you've documented, the victims you've given a voice, it's all contributed to what we believe will be the largest criminal prosecution in the history of the American West. Agnes felt a familiar mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice for the victims was always worth celebrating, but it never brought back the lives that had been lost. How many women? We've documented over 400 suspicious deaths over the past 20 years, with property theft totaling more than $200 million. The prosecutor replied. And there are probably many more cases we'll never know about. Hope looked up from her perch on General Hayes's knee. Mama Agnes, what are they talking about? Agnes smoothed the child's dark hair so much like Ellen's. They're talking about making sure bad people can't hurt good people anymore, sweetheart. Like the bad people who hurt my first mama. Yes, exactly like that. Hope nodded seriously, as if this made perfect sense to her 3-year-old mind. Good. Bad people should go to jail. The prosecutor smiled. Miss Doyle, there's something else. The president has signed legislation creating a new federal office dedicated to investigating crimes against women and children throughout the United States. He's specifically requested that you be appointed as the first director. Agnes felt her breath catch. A federal appointment would mean more resources, more authority, the ability to pursue cases across state boundaries without interference from local corruption. It would also mean more danger, more time away from Hope, more difficult decisions about balancing her duty to other victims with her responsibility to the child in her care. I would need time to consider, she began. Mama Agnes should take the job. Hope interrupted with the confident voice of a child who had grown up hearing stories about justice and courage. She's really good at catching bad people, and there are lots of bad people who need catching. General Hayes laughed. Out of the mouths of babes. What do you say, Agnes, ready to take on the federal government? Agnes looked at Hope, who was grinning at her with Ellen's smile and her own determination. The child had never known a world where her guardian wasn't fighting for justice, never questioned why they traveled constantly, or why their house was always full of women seeking help and protection. To Hope, this was simply what people did. They helped each other, they fought against evil. They made the world safer for everyone. I'll take the job, Agnes said. But Hope comes with me, and Cora continues as my deputy. We're a team. Wouldn't have it any other way. The prosecutor agreed. Mrs. Marshall Harrison has already accepted a position as your deputy director. As the officials prepared to leave, Hope tugged on Agnes's skirt. Mama Agnes, will this mean we can help even more people? Yes, sweetheart, many more people. Good. I want to help too when I'm bigger. Agnes knelt down to Hope's level, looking into the bright, serious eyes that held so much of Ellen's spirit. Your mama, your first mama, would be so proud of you, Hope. She wanted you to grow up strong and brave and good, and that's exactly what you're doing. Hope threw her arms around Agnes's neck, holding tight. I love you, Mama Agnes. I love you too, little one, more than you'll ever know. That evening, after Hope had gone to bed, Agnes sat in her study reading Ellen's confession letter one more time. She had read it hundreds of times over the years, but tonight she noticed something she had missed before a small notation in the margin, almost invisible in Ellen's fading ink. Tell Hope that love is stronger than fear, stronger than greed, stronger than death itself. Tell her that her mama will always be watching over her and that every act of courage she performs honors all the women who came before her. Agnes smiled through her tears, understanding finally that Ellen's gift had been more than just a child to love and protect. It had been a mission, a calling, a chance to transform tragedy into hope and death into life. Hope Doyle Lane would grow up knowing that she was loved. But more than that, she would grow up knowing that love required action, that courage was a choice, and that justice was worth any sacrifice. Outside, the Denver evening was peaceful and quiet. But Agnes knew that somewhere in the vast American West, there were women in danger, children threatened by greed and violence, families destroyed by powerful men who thought they were above the law. Tomorrow she would begin the work of hunting them down, one case at a time, one victim at a time, until every woman could sleep safely and every child could grow up free from fear. She folded Ellen's letter carefully and placed it back in its protective case, then went to check on Hope one last time before bed. The little girl was sleeping peacefully, her dark hair spread across the pillow, one small hand clutching a rag doll that Cora had made for her. Agnes adjusted Hope's blankets and kissed her forehead gently. "Sweet dreams, my darling," she whispered. "Your mama and I are going to make sure you never have to be afraid." As she turned to leave, Hope stirred and mumbled in her sleep, "Love is stronger, Mama Agnes. Love is always stronger." Agnes smiled and closed the door softly. Ellen Lane's daughter was going to change the world, and Agnes would be there to help her do it. The war they had fought in Sandridge had been won, but the greater battle for justice and protection of the innocent would continue as long as there were people willing to fight for what was right. And in a house in Denver, surrounded by love and protected by courage, a little girl slept peacefully, dreaming of a future where bad people couldn't hurt good people anymore, where love always won in the end, where her two mothers, one in heaven and one by her side, would always keep her safe. The chapel in Sand Ridge was gone, burned to ash and memory. But the love and courage it had sheltered lived on in Hope Doyle Lane, and through her Ellen's sacrifice would echo through generations yet to come. Justice had been served, love had triumphed, and hope, beautiful, innocent, unstoppable hope, would carry their legacy into whatever battles lay ahead. In the end, love had indeed proven stronger than fear, stronger than greed, stronger than death itself. Marcus Holloway and his network of killers were gone, brought down by the courage of women who refused to be silenced and the determination of those who loved them. The system that had protected murderers and punished victims was crumbling, replaced by one that valued justice over wealth, truth over power. And in the quiet house in Denver, where a federal advocate for women's rights planned her next case and a 3-year-old heiress dreamed of catching bad people, the truth slept peacefully until morning, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Hope Doyle Lane would grow up to become the most famous advocate for women's rights in the American West, following in her adoptive mother's footsteps, but surpassing even Agnes's achievements. She would use her inherited wealth to fund schools for women, legal aid societies, and safe houses for those fleeing domestic violence. The Holloway fortune, built on the blood of innocent women, would be transformed into a force for justice and protection. But that is a story for another day. For now, it was enough that love had conquered evil, that courage had defeated corruption, and that a baby abandoned in a blizzard had grown into a symbol of hope for all those who needed protection in a harsh and unforgiving world. The story was complete, every thread woven tight, every promise kept. Agnes Doyle had found her redemption not in exile and penance, but in love and sacrifice for others. Ellen Lane's love had transcended death to protect her daughter and create a legacy of justice. And Hope, beautiful, brave, beloved Hope, carried the dreams of 2 mothers into a future where women could be safe, children could be protected, and love could indeed prove stronger than all the darkness in the world.